The snow fell in soft, heavy flakes over Bath Ford that evening, muting every sound, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Helen Foster sat by the window of her small stone cottage, the one she had shared with her husband and daughter before the accident. The fire crackled in the hearth, and beside her sat a mug of untouched tea, long gone cold. It was on nights like this that Helen's thoughts became unbearable. The laughter that once filled the rooms had vanished, replaced by a hollow quiet that seemed to echo her grief. She had given up writing, her publisher's letters went unanswered. There was nothing left to say. Then, just as the clock struck 9, a faint knock echoed from the front door. It was hesitant, almost polite, but it startled her nonetheless. Helen froze. Few people visited Windermere Lane, especially not during a snowstorm. She stood and wrapped her cardigan tightly around her before opening the door. The cold rushed in, biting her skin. Standing there, in the swirling snow, was a young girl, no older than 10, wearing a thin coat far too small for her. Her cheeks were flushed red from the cold, and her eyes, wide and unblinking, met Helen's with a strange intensity. "Please," the girl said softly. "I'm sorry for coming so late. But, my mum said you'd know who I am." Helen blinked, confusion flooding her. "I think you must be mistaken," she replied, glancing up and down the empty lane. "Who is your mother?" The girl looked down, clutching a worn, leather-bound book to her chest. She said, "You'd understand when you see this." She held the book out with trembling hands. Helen took it slowly, wiping the snow from its cover. Her heart stopped. Her name was embossed in fading gold letters across the front, by Helen Foster. It was her first book, the one she had written for her daughter years ago. Helen stared at the girl. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. The child didn't answer. She only murmured, "Mum said you'd know." Helen hesitated, then stepped aside. "Come in before you freeze to death," she said softly. The girl entered without a word, her boots leaving small pools of melted snow on the rug. As Helen shut the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that the air inside the cottage had changed, colder, somehow, but alive. When Helen looked back, the girl was already sitting near the fireplace, her book still clutched tightly in her lap. For the first time in a year, Helen felt something stir deep within her. But she couldn't tell if it was hope or fear. By morning, the storm had quietened, leaving the world outside glazed in white. Helen awoke early, expecting to find the girl still asleep on the sofa, but the room was empty. The blanket lay neatly folded, and beside it sat the leather-bound book, untouched. Helen's heart thudded. For a dreadful moment, she wondered if she had imagined it all, the knock, the girl, the strange words. Yet as she turned toward the kitchen, the smell of toast greeted her. The girl stood there, her small hands clutching a butter knife, spreading marmalade with careful precision. "You were up early," Helen said, trying to sound calm. The girl looked up and smiled faintly. "I didn't want to wake you. I used to make breakfast for Mum." Helen hesitated. "And where is your mother now?" The girl's smile faltered. She stared at the toast for a long moment before whispering, "She went away. She said I had to find you first." There it was again, that impossible statement. Helen studied the child, searching her face for some clue. She was pale, but not sickly. Her dark hair was tangled, her eyes deep and unreadable. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Helen asked softly. The girl tilted her head. "I think it's Isabel." "You think?" She nodded. "That's what Mum used to call me when she was happy." Helen's chest tightened. Something about the girl's words tugged at an old wound, one she had spent months trying to bury. She changed the subject quickly. "You must be hungry. Sit down and eat." They ate in silence, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Helen couldn't shake the feeling that the girl was watching her, not with curiosity, but with quiet knowing. After breakfast, Helen wrapped the girl in a thicker jumper and walked with her to the village. She needed to alert someone, the police, perhaps. But as she asked gentle questions along the way, it became clear that Isabel knew very little about herself. She didn't remember her address, her school, or her father's name. Only that her mother had died not long ago, and that the book would lead her to safety. When they reached the small police post by the square, Isabel suddenly clutched Helen's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Please don't leave me here," she whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "They won't believe me. They'll send me back." Helen frowned. "Back where?" The girl shook her head violently. "I can't go back. Please, don't let them take me." Helen's mouth went dry. There was something in the girl's tone, desperation mixed with dread, that made her hesitate. Against her better judgment, she turned away from the station. "Come on," she said quietly. "Let's go home." That evening, as dusk fell over Wintermere Lane, Helen lit a single candle on her writing desk. She stared at the leather-bound book and, after a moment, opened it. On the inside cover, written in her own handwriting, were the words, "For Lydia, my light in the dark." Her daughter's name. Helen's breath caught. When she looked up, Isabel was standing in the doorway, watching her. And she was smiling. The days that followed seemed to blur into one another. Helen found herself falling into a strange rhythm with Isabel, quiet breakfasts, walks through the frostbitten garden, and evenings spent by the fire. The girl was polite, soft-spoken, and eerily mature for her age. Too mature, Helen often thought. Yet there were moments, fleeting, unsettling moments, when Helen could not shake the feeling that Isabel was not what she seemed. One night, as Helen prepared for bed, she heard the faintest whisper drifting through the hallway. It was a child's voice, delicate and distant, humming a tune that made her skin crawl. The melody was familiar, something her daughter, Lydia, used to hum before she went to sleep. Helen froze at the top of the stairs. "Isabel," she called softly. The whispering stopped. Heart pounding, Helen descended the steps, each creak of the wood echoing like a warning. The sitting room was empty, the fire burned low. Then she saw her, the girl, standing by the old piano, her small fingers tracing the dust-covered keys. "What are you doing up?" Helen asked, trying to sound gentle. Isabel didn't turn. "I couldn't sleep," she said quietly. "The house talks when it's dark." Helen frowned. "What do you mean, it talks?" The girl looked up then, her eyes glinting in the dim light. "You can't hear it. It says your name sometimes." A shiver ran down Helen's spine. "That's enough nonsense for tonight. Off to bed." Isabel nodded, but as she passed, Helen caught the faint scent of lavender, the same perfume Lydia used to love. For a moment, Helen's vision blurred, and she had to steady herself against the wall. After Isabel had gone upstairs, Helen stood alone in the dimly lit room, her breath shallow. She turned toward the writing desk, and something caught her eye. The leather-bound book was open, though she was certain she had left it closed. She stepped closer. The pages were filled with new words, written in the same looping handwriting as her own. But she hadn't written them. "She remembers you. She's waiting. Do not let her in." Helen's throat went dry. The ink was fresh. Still glistening. A sudden thud upstairs made her flinch. She rushed to the staircase, calling out, "Isabel." No answer. The sound came again, 3 knocks, rhythmic and hollow, coming from Lydia's old bedroom. Helen hesitated, every instinct screaming for her to turn away. But she reached for the doorknob anyway. As she pushed the door open, the faint smell of lavender filled the air. The room was cold, untouched since the day Lydia had gone. Moonlight spilled across the floor, revealing Isabel standing by the window, her pale hands pressed against the glass. She turned slowly to face Helen. She says she misses you, Isabel whispered. Helen's heart stopped. Who does? But the girl only smiled and pointed toward the reflection in the window. There, just for a second, Helen saw it. A second figure beside Isabel. A girl with Lydia's golden hair, smiling faintly back at her. And then she was gone. The next morning dawned grey and still, with mist curling low across the garden. Helen had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the reflection, the faint smile, the golden hair. She told herself it was exhaustion, grief playing tricks again. But the unease would not leave her. When she went downstairs, Isabel was already sitting at the table, reading from the leather-bound book. Her lips moved soundlessly over the words. Helen froze. That book is not for you, she said sharply. The girl blinked, her expression unreadable. But it's about me, she replied simply. Helen snatched the book from her hands, her pulse quickening. Don't ever touch it again. Isabel stared for a moment, then whispered, You don't remember yet, do you? Helen's grip tightened around the book. What are you talking about? But the girl only smiled faintly and turned her gaze to the window. It's nearly time. Helen felt her stomach twist. Later that day, she locked the book away in her writing desk, a desk she had not opened since her husband's passing. She turned the brass key, then slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan. Yet even after she left the room, she swore she heard a faint scratching sound from within the drawer, like a quill dragging across paper. As the day wore on, small things began to change. The radio turned itself on, playing the same lullaby Lydia had loved. The picture frame on the mantel tilted by itself. And when Helen passed the mirror in the hall, for the briefest second, she saw not her own face, but Lydia's. By evening, she could no longer bear it. She poured herself a brandy, sat by the fire, and tried to steady her shaking hands. Isabel sat across from her, cross-legged on the rug, humming that same haunting melody. Helen spoke at last, her voice low. Who are you, really? The girl's eyes met hers. You already know, she whispered. You wrote me. Helen blinked. What? Isabel stood, her small frame silhouetted by the firelight. You wrote me into the story the night Lydia died. You wished for another chance to hold her, to see her smile again. And then I came. Helen shook her head. No, that's absurd. But even as she said it, her heart faltered. She remembered that night, the storm, the brandy, the open notebook. The words she had scrawled in grief, if only I could see her again, I would give anything. Her breath hitched. That's not possible. Isabel tilted her head. You gave something, Helen. You just don't remember what it was. A gust of wind rattled the windows. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Helen stood, reaching for a candle. When the flame sparked to life, she turned. The girl was gone. In her place, the drawer of the writing desk stood wide open. Inside, the leather-bound book lay waiting, its pages turning slowly on their own. That night, Helen could not sleep. The house felt colder than usual, as though every breath she took carried frost. She lay awake listening to the wind tapping against the window, the old timbers of the house creaking softly like whispering voices. When the clock struck 2, she heard footsteps on the landing. Light, deliberate. A child's steps. She rose and opened her door slightly. Down the hall, a faint glow spilled from the study, her study. She had locked it earlier, or so she thought. Slowly, she made her way down the corridor. The door was ajar, and the scent of candle wax drifted out. Inside, the girl sat at Helen's desk, turning the pages of the old leather-bound book. What are you doing in here? Helen's voice was quiet but trembled. The girl looked up, her eyes reflecting the flame. I wanted to read your stories, she said softly. They're all about me. Helen stepped closer. On the desk, the book lay open on a page she did not recognize. The handwriting was hers, but the words described tonight. Every word. Helen standing by the door. The girl at the desk. Even her question. Her hand trembled as she reached for the page. "Who told you about this?" she whispered. The girl smiled faintly. "You did." The candle flickered, and the page turned by itself. The next paragraph spoke of the fire that would break out in the study. Helen barely had time to look up before the candle flame leapt, the wax spilling across the tablecloth, catching the corner of a stack of papers. Helen snatched a blanket and smothered the small fire, coughing through the smoke. When she lifted the cloth again, the girl was gone. Only the open book remained, the edges of its pages scorched but untouched by flame. Helen stared at the book, her pulse pounding. The last sentence written in her own looping hand read, she realized too late that the story was writing itself. She closed the book with shaking fingers, the air around her still faintly warm from the fire. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the soft patter of feet on the stairs and the faint echo of a child's laughter fading into the dark. Morning light crept through the curtains, grey and thin. Helen had fallen asleep at her desk, the closed book resting beneath her arm. Her throat was sore from the smoke, and her mind throbbed with fragments of the night before. The scent of burnt paper still lingered. She walked to the kitchen, brewed tea with shaking hands, and tried to convince herself that it had all been a nightmare. But when she lifted her gaze to the window, she froze. Across the glass, faint letters had been traced into the condensation, letters that formed a single word, Emily. Her breath caught. That was her daughter's name. The mug slipped from her grasp and shattered on the floor. Helen stumbled back, eyes wide. The handwriting was unmistakably her own, curved and elegant. Yet she hadn't touched the glass. Driven by something between fear and hope, she went upstairs to the small guest room where the girl had been sleeping. The bed was neatly made. The window slightly ajar. And on the pillow lay a single sheet torn from the mysterious book. The page described a scene she had never written, a mother looking for her lost child, only to find that the child had never truly gone. Her pulse quickened as she noticed the mirror above the dresser. It was fogged, though the air was cold and still. Slowly, she stepped closer. There, faint but unmistakable, was a reflection beside her own. The outline of a little girl standing just over her shoulder. Helen turned sharply, but no one was there. The room was empty. Yet the reflection lingered in the mirror. The girl's eyes, solemn and knowing, locked with Helen's. And then, with deliberate slowness, the girl wrote across the misted glass, "Find the last chapter." The mirror cleared as if a gust of unseen wind had passed. Helen stood trembling, tears threatening to spill. She returned to her study, pulled open drawers, overturned piles of paper. The book was there, but the final pages were missing. As she searched, a sound rose from the hallway, a soft rustle, like a page turning. Then came a whisper, clear and close to her ear, though no one was near. "You stopped writing because you were afraid of remembering." Helen spun around. The corridor was empty, the silence heavy. But deep inside, she began to remember something, an unfinished story, one she had never dared to complete. A story about a little girl named Emily, who had once lived in this house. And for the first time, Helen realized that perhaps the girl who had appeared at her door wasn't a stranger at all. Rain began to fall that afternoon, steady and cold, drumming against the windows of the old house. Helen moved through the hallway like a ghost herself, her mind consumed by one thought, the missing pages. Somewhere inside Wintermere Lane, the story she had once tried to bury was waiting to be found. Her steps led her to the end of the corridor, where a narrow door stood half hidden behind a tall cabinet. She had never paid attention to it before. The handle was rusted, the frame coated in dust. Yet as she reached for it, a strange warmth radiated from the metal, as though someone had touched it only moments earlier. The door creaked open. A gust of stale air escaped, carrying with it the faint scent of lavender and smoke. Inside lay a small attic room. A child's room. The wallpaper was faded with tiny stars, and an old wooden cradle rested beneath the window. The sight made Helen's knees weaken. She stepped inside slowly, her heart pounding. On a shelf sat a box of toys, tiny wooden animals, a cloth doll with one button eye, and a stack of books. She lifted the doll and brushed off the dust. Its dress was familiar, blue with white lace. It was the same one Emily had worn the day of the accident. Helen sank to her knees, tears spilling freely. "Oh, Emily." As her voice broke, a cold breeze swept through the room, and one of the books on the shelf slid forward, falling open onto the floor. Inside, between the pages, was a folded sheet of paper. Her breath hitched as she unfolded it. It was written in her handwriting, but she had no memory of writing it. The words at the top read, "The last chapter." Her hands trembled as she read the first lines. The mother could not bear her grief, so she locked the memories away, hiding her daughter's room and sealing the truth within her own story. But grief, like love, finds its way back home. Helen's tears blurred the ink. The truth began to unfurl in her mind. She had written about Emily's death to ease the pain, but the story had consumed her. She had hidden this room, forgotten it, buried it beneath layers of denial. And now, the book, the girl, had brought her back to face what she had left unfinished. Suddenly, the cradle creaked. Helen froze. It rocked gently, though no one was near. Then she heard it, a faint hum, a lullaby she used to sing. Her voice quavered. "Emily, is that you?" The lullaby faded, replaced by the whisper of a small voice behind her. "Mum, it's time to finish the story." Helen turned slowly, heart pounding, to see the faint outline of her daughter standing by the window, her pale figure bathed in the silver light of the rain. Helen's hands trembled as she stepped closer to the window, the rain streaking the glass like tears. Emily's faint figure looked real, yet ghostly, as if she existed both in the room and beyond it. Helen realized she no longer needed to search for answers. Everything had been here all along. The leather-bound book rested on the desk. She opened it to the blank pages at the end. Her pen hovered, hesitant, then she began to write. "I remember now. I remember you, my darling. I remember your laughter, your tears, and the warmth of your hand in mine. I will finish the story, for you, and for us." As she wrote, the room seemed to shift. The cold air softened. The faint scent of lavender filled the space, comforting and familiar. The outline of Emily grew clearer, no longer pale and distant, but smiling, full of life. Isabel appeared behind her, quiet, watching. Helen looked up briefly and saw that the girl was no longer a stranger. She was a bridge, a piece of magic that had guided Helen back to her daughter. Helen wrote the final words. The mother and daughter embraced once more, no longer separated by death or grief. The story was complete, the love eternal. The pen fell from her hand. The room was still. The mirror reflected Helen and Emily side by side, the girl's laughter echoing softly. Helen felt her heart swell with relief, sorrow melting into peace. She turned to Isabel, whose eyes sparkled with understanding. The girl nodded, a faint smile on her lips. Then, as silently as she had appeared, Isabel vanished. Helen did not panic. Somehow, she knew the girl had fulfilled her purpose. Helen reached out and touched Emily's hand, real and warm. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The house was no longer haunted by loss, but by memory and love. Outside, the rain had stopped. Sunlight pierced the clouds, illuminating Wintermere Lane with a soft, golden glow. Helen held Emily close, and together they stepped into the warmth of the day, the story finally at rest.